Gooch with the law firm of Bass, Berry and Sims. It's November the 27th, 2017, and I have the pleasure this afternoon of interviewing my longtime friend and law partner, James H. Cheek III. So, Mr. Cheek, are you ready?
Yes, sir.
Well, let's start with your full name this time.
Yes, my full name is James Howe Cheek III.
And where were you born and when?
I was born in Nashville, Tennessee, November 28, 1942. I will turn a magic number of 75 tomorrow.
Well, that's great. Tell us a little bit about your family, Jim. Start with your grandparents.
My grandparents on my father's side his name was James Howe Cheek. He was the senior. My father was the junior, and I'm the third. He was born in Nashville. He was a manager of various coffee plants across the country. He first managed a coffee plant of the Cheek Neal Coffee Company in Richmond, Virginia, where my father was born. And then he was asked to lead the western operations of the Cheek Neal Coffee Company in Los Angeles, where my father grew up. And then he retired shortly after the company was sold to Charlottesville, Virginia, and then to Daytona Beach, Florida. And my grandmother, I never knew, unfortunately. She died early when my father was in college. Her name was Sarah Robertson Cheek.
See.
And do you want my grandparents on my mother's side?
Absolutely do.
Were Anna and Grady Huddleston. They grew up in Pulaski, Tennessee, and lived in Nashville most of their life. My grandfather on my mother's side was the executive director of the Tennessee Bankers Association for many years. And they lived actually, they built a house on Clarendon Avenue, and I eventually moved as a young child next door to them.
I see. And you knew your grandmother on your mother's side quite well.
Quite well. As we called her, Granny, was quite a pistol, as they would say. She was a fiery redhead, and I spent a lot of time over at their house once we had moved to the house next door to them. So yes, she certainly has great credit to raising me.
And Jim, the Cheek name has a lot of prominence in Nashville. Go back a generation or two and tell us about your relationship to Joel Cheek and what he did.
Joel O. Cheek was born in Burkesville, Kentucky, and was an itinerant horseback salesperson selling to local small village and city grocery stores, various dry goods. And he and a gentleman named Neal decided to form a coffee company that was known as the Cheek Neal Coffee Company, because he saw an opportunity in his sales efforts to provide a higher grade of coffee to the local marketplaces. So they devised a formula, imported beans from South America, and formed the Cheek Neal Coffee Company, or it was better known to produce the product called Maxwell House Coffee. And I never knew him, but he had 8 sons and 1 daughter, and my grandfather was one of those sons.
I see. And that company was quite successful, was it not?
It was quite successful, and in 1929, right before the Depression, it was sold to General Foods Corporation. And I might add, Bass, Berry and Sims represented the Cheek Neal Coffee Company in that sale.
I think that's a nice twist right there. And so, did any of your ancestors have a particular influence on you?
Well, I think to some extent, indirectly, all did, but certainly my father and my mother were the most influential of my ancestors. My grandfather, when I was growing up, lived in Daytona Beach, and certainly my granny as I called her, and my grandfather were quite influential. We had Sunday dinner over at their house every night, and I used to travel in the summertime with my grandfather to all the rural communities around Tennessee to go visit the bankers. And that actually, later on in my career, were very useful because I could talk to people in Lenore City and, Johnson City and local communities that I had been to as a child.
Tell me a little bit about your father's early life and his business career.
As I said, my father grew up in his teenage years out in Los Angeles, and then decided to go to Virginia Military Institute, VMI, in Virginia. I'm not sure whether he decided that or his father decided that, but that's where he wound up. And then he went to MIT and got a postgraduate degree in electrical engineering. He went to work in Schenectady, New York, for General Electric in developing, as an electrical engineer, some of the first radar machines in the country. And then he was called to the war. Obviously, he had a commitment going to a military institute, was called to the war, and had a very distinguished career in the Army, in the 7th Armored Infantry Division, where he rose to the level of a captain and had all kinds of bronze medals and things that reflected his warfare battles, particularly in the Battle of the Bulge. He served under General Patton. When he came back to live with my mother and me. I was a little infant at that time. And he went to work for Genesco, or General Shoe Company as it was known then. And he had a career in Genesco as the senior vice president that was in charge of manufacturing. At that point, all shoes, for the most part, that were sold in the United States were manufactured in the United States. And he was in charge of 12 different manufacturing plants.
And Genesco, where was it based?
It was based in Nashville on 7th Avenue, just off of Broadway. And I remember going down many weekends with my father and playing around that area on 7th Avenue, which was quite different then than today.
And do you have any siblings?
No, I'm an only child of 2 only children.
So who was the only child in the generation above you? Your father?
And my mother.
And your mother?
Yeah.
I see. And what
so
about...
I had no first cousins and no uncles or aunts.
I see.
Although I had a lot of people I called uncle or aunt.
And tell us a little bit about where you went to school in your early years.
I started, my family's first home was on Gray Bar Lane over near Green Hills, and I grew up there through the age of 9 and went to Stokes Elementary School. Used to walk to school, and one of my early memories was Easter Sunday bringing the whole class up to my house because the Easter Bunny had left a set of bunnies. So we had a good time looking at those. I do remember that very vividly. And then when I was in the 3rd grade, after the 3rd grade, my family moved to Evelyn Avenue, which is next door to my grandmother in Belmead, and I grew up in that house and went to Palmer School. And then from Palmer School, I went to MBA in the 7th grade and graduated in MBA in 1960.
And what sort of activities did you do at MBA?
I tried to survive. It was a hard school, still is today. I managed to have a decent grade point average and made the privilege list and things recognized academic achievement, but I did not play football for Tommy Owen, and I somewhat regret that. But on a higher level, I really am glad I didn't hurt myself during that period of time. But Tommy Owen, I think, always was disappointed that I didn't play football, but I played tennis.
I see.
Tennis at that time was not a highly respected sport for young men, but I loved it and played a lot of tennis and lettered all 4 years at NBA and won the state championship a couple of times.
And did you engage in any other sports? Did you play basketball, for example?
I played a lot of basketball, but I did not play varsity basketball because I think I was on the bad list for not having played football.
I see. Are there any other experiences from your high school years that stand out to you?
You know, the high school years to me were really transitional years of growth. And one of the areas of growth was the tight-knit culture of the NBA community. It's something that carries forward today. And so there were a lot of remembrances that relate to growing up with a bunch of boys my age. And when we had our 50th reunion several years ago, we had 3/4 of the class back, and it was really, really meaningful to hash out our lives as they unfolded.
Have you remained friends with a number of those people?
I have. My closest childhood friend is a lawyer, Jimmy Cheshire, who worked for many years at the Waller Law Firm, and we still share birthday lunches together. I take him out on his birthday, and hopefully he'll take me out tomorrow.
What did you do in the summers?
Well, I actually worked. And I started my sophomore year in high school working for an investment banking firm in Nashville called J.C. Bradford and Company. And that summer I did the old-fashioned marking the board. And in those days there weren't electronic stock quotes or anything. They came across a ticker tape. And I would take the ticker tape from a back room, take it out to the front of a big chalkboard, and mark up the prices of the various stocks that were on the chalkboard. And the customers of J.C. Bradford had a big bullpen there that they would sit, and they would try to bribe me into giving them information before anybody else had them, but I didn't do that. I was too good a boy. And anyhow, that J.C. Bradford at that time was on Union Street, and it was a good local investment banking firm at that point. And I worked my sophomore summer, my junior summer, my senior summer, my freshman college summer, and my sophomore college summer at J.C. Bradford, doing everything in the business. Ultimately, in the last couple of summers when I was in college, I traded stocks and bonds for them.
And Jim, do you think that had an impact on the career that you've had?
Absolutely did. It gave me a great foundation into how the industry worked. I was always fascinated by the business side of the securities industry, and that really, I think, shaped my long-term interest in securities law and corporate law and how they all interfaced going forward. I had no idea at that time I'd be a lawyer, but none whatsoever. I had no lawyers in the family.
So the next step along the line was college, and how did you make that selection?
Probably not like they make it today. I was dating a young lady in Nashville at that time. I knew I wanted to go away from Nashville to school, and I applied to Princeton, Rice, and Duke. Didn't go to any of them in a visit like they do today. Got into all three and chose Duke because it was the closest to Nashville and I could see my girlfriend. So not too logical.
And so tell us a little bit about the Duke experience.
Oh, Duke was a great experience. Again, a growing experience for me. Um, I became close friends from day one with a group of folks that were mostly Eastern based, lived in New Jersey, lived in Poughkeepsie. It just had a broadening sense for me. My roommate was from Kingsport, Tennessee, and he flunked out after the first semester. I'm not sure I had that influence, but we played a lot of poker at night, and I don't think he got up much the next day. So anyhow, we had a good time, good thing. I was able to play college sports. I was able to play 4 years of college tennis. Wound up playing #1 doubles and #2 singles during my last 2 years there, and we had a lot of fun traveling as a tennis team, and it was a good time.
Now, I think you tried your hand at basketball, did you not, as well?
I did. I was a walk-on on the freshman team, and you know, at that time there were freshman teams who could not play in the varsity. So part of the team was Jeff Mullins, who went on to a legitimate NBA career, and we still remain friends, and Steve Salisbury and Bill Ulrich and Jay Buckley. We had a really good time. Now, I didn't play much. but
That's fast company.
Yeah.
So any influential professors for you at Duke that you remember?
Well, my Duke experience was a little varied. I got in, I guess it was primarily due to my father's educational experience. I went and applied and got into the engineering school. And after the first semester, dropped out of engineering because of engineering drawing. And there were two negatives to engineering drawing. One, they were always in the afternoon from 3 to 5. That didn't suit my schedule. And secondly, I couldn't draw worth a darn. So, you know, I think I got a D minus there. Anyhow, I went from that to majoring in physics, and then in math, and then I went pre-med, and finally I settled on economics and political science. So I couldn't find anything that really I loved. And in political science, and this gets back to your question, there was a professor, Robert Rankin, R-A-N-K-I-N, who taught constitutional law. And I took that course, and he made it alive, and it just gelled with me. So it was the first time, and that was in my senior year, it was the first time that I ever thought about law as a career.
And what year would this have been?
1963, fall of 1963.
Yes. And then what made you decide to pursue a graduate school education?
Nothing else to do. And as I mentioned, I had no lawyers in the immediate family. I had this great experience with Dr. Rankin. I also had been president of a club on campus that focused on legal and international affairs, and we had gone to New York, and I'll never forget this. I had an interview with Eleanor Roosevelt, and one of the things she said was, the most influential persons that I've seen in public life are lawyers. And I remembered that when I was trying to figure in my senior year what I would do. I actually had plans to go play the tennis circuit. And I actually went and played in a couple of tournaments after I graduated. And I didn't apply to law school until May of my senior year. And the only reason I got in law school, and I owe him a great deal of debt, is then the Associate Dean John S. Beasley. John Beasley took a liking, as they say, to me when I came to plead my case to go to law school. And he said, you know, we may take a chance on you. So he admitted me. I'm not sure there was a committee that looked at my file, but he admitted me, and I came to law school after I went through Europe that summer. I actually came in late to law school. And I'm amazed to this day that it fit my talents and personality so well.
Did you look at any other law schools?
No, I only applied on May. I was lucky.
Yeah.
That's all I can say. I was lucky. I didn't know what I would do. I really didn't.
How many members were in your class? About at Vanderbilt Law School.
Oh, at Vanderbilt Law School, I'd say you should remember. I'd say 130. What would you say? 110. 110. I stand corrected. 110.
Yeah. And so tell us a little bit about your law school experience.
It was fabulous. Again, academically, I found it to suit my abilities to do well. I liked the professors at that time, and you know, it was a unique time in law school life. The professors were very available at all times to chat with. There was one professor that I absolutely became a great mentor to me, Professor Elliott Cheatham, who had had a distinguished career at Columbia in law school and came down to Vanderbilt in his retirement years. But as important as the academics was the classmates and the camaraderie the class had. It was a unique time where you would study with people, you would party with people, and they became your lifelong friends.
And so I gather from that there's still a lot of members of that class that are your friends today.
Yes, one sitting in a blue suit across from me, Mr. James Gooch, yes. But a number of others. We just had our 50th class reunion, and we had 40 people, 35 to 40 people back, which was pretty good, almost half the class. And it was great to see those folks that you had such a shared history.
Jim, talk a little bit about what you did in the summers between the school years.
Well, the interesting thing about that was at that time there were very few firms that actually came to Vanderbilt Law School to interview. And because of my background at J.C. Bradford and the interest in the securities world, I wanted to go practice Wall Street law, which at that time was where the mecca of securities law practice was. And so no Wall Street, no New York firms came to Nashville, and I sent off probably 20, 25 letters to the biggest New York law firms asking for an interview. Not for them to pay my way up there, but I would pay my way up if they just see me. And I think out of all those, I got 3 interviews. Vanderbilt Law School was thought of as a very regional, local law school. It was not the national law school it is today. And so I interviewed each of those. 2 of them did not work out with an offer, but the 3rd did, and I went to work in the summer following my 2nd year at Sherman and Sterling, which was a great, great experience for me. I was able to do corporate and securities work as a law clerk. I saw how the big law firms approached problems, how they wrestled with solutions to difficult, complex issues that were of big importance to the economy at that time. So it was really a wonderful experience. I had a really great relationship with the hiring partner at that time named William Rockefeller, who the only reason I think I got the job was William Rockefeller had cousins in Nashville, Tennessee, and they had spoken to him about me. So that was a lucky break.
So then your senior year in law school occurs, and the spring comes, and you're thinking about what comes next. How did that go?
Well, as you remember, that was a time of great turmoil in our country. We were in the middle of the Vietnam War, and we had this was before the lottery, and we had student deferments through the end of that third year. But they were getting rid of student deferments, and the rumor was that there was one more year, but it wasn't certain. So I applied to the JAG, Corps Judge Advocates General, got a commission from the Navy to report to Newport, Rhode Island. But the more I thought, I also had applied to graduate school at Harvard Law School because I wanted to go and work with the dean of the securities law at that time academically, was Lou Loss at Harvard Law School. And I got accepted to their LLM program, and I had to make a decision there. And I probably might have made a poor decision, but it worked out fine in the end. But I chose to go to Harvard and turn down the JAG commission. And so that's how I wound up at Harvard in the year of 1960, fall of 67 and spring of 68.
And the LLM was in what?
They don't have, they just have a general LLM. And from the Harvard's point of view, they would say that they are a, quote, access point for law teachers. So as opposed to NYU, where you would get an LLM in tax to practice tax law, they don't have an LLM in corporate or securities law. But what I did do, I was a student assistant for Lou Loss when I was there, and so I got a heavy dose of both academic and practical experience while I was there. And I became active at the JFK Institute of Politics there, which was a blend of the law and public service issues that carried me forward later in life. And I also was freshman tennis coach.
Didn't know that, actually. So the year goes by, you have good result there. You obviously enjoyed that experience, the Harvard experience.
I did, and fortunately, Sherman and Sterling had said, you know, we would welcome you back at any time. We understand you taking this off, but again, I sought to avoid going to Vietnam, and I accepted a teaching job at Vanderbilt Law School. And the law school facilitated me getting an occupational deferment.
And you might describe that story in a little more detail.
Well, I had several teaching offers, one of which I had accepted, but the draft board had turned my occupational deferment down. And so when Dean Wade, then the dean of Vanderbilt Law School, called me it was actually in May, and I was graduating in June and getting married in June, and he called and said, I understand you're interested in teaching. I said, yes, sir, I am, but I've got a little problem about that. I can't get a deferment to do that, and I'm classified 1A, which at that time meant any day I would get my greetings from Uncle Sam letter. He said, you draft board in Nashville? I said, yes, sir. Well, let me make a few calls. And so I am blessed the fact that he was able to make a case that Vanderbilt had an important need for someone to come in, not just to teach, but also to take over the administrative duties that they had vacant for a couple of years, basically forming an alumni network for the law school.
And whose place did you roughly take at Vanderbilt Law School? Who had done that work before you?
They had not had well, I think Harold Bigelow may have taught securities regulation the year we were in school. I can't recall that, but I don't think there was anybody that had the degree of passion that I did for that subject matter.
I was really also thinking about the administrative responsibility.
There was nobody. John Beasley was the associate dean, and Dean Wade was the dean, and John Beasley was devoted passionately to building a national law school by recruiting students into the school and dealing with various other administrators. So they didn't have a unique person in the school devoted to alumni affairs. It all came from central administration at Vanderbilt.
And so, Jim, how many years were you at Vanderbilt?
Two at that time. I was an assistant professor and assistant dean for 2 years until 1970.
Now, when that period ended, the Vietnam War was still underway.
But they'd gone to the lottery system, and I had a very high lottery number.
So you had some flexibility in choosing a career.
Right, and so that was and at that time I'd also gotten married on June 1st, 1968, and we had our first child in 1970. And so circumstances sort of changed, and I married a girl from New York, and I always thought we'd go back to New York and practice law there. But much to my surprise, and pleasantly so, she loved Nashville, and we made the decision to stay in Nashville. I interviewed around the country with a lot of different firms, and I remember sending letters out to those firms saying that I decided to stay in Nashville, and I had to go have a drink because I felt like I was, at that time, Nashville really did not have a highly sophisticated corporate and securities practice.
And so, adding all those factors up, your call from Dean Wade, the choice to return to Vanderbilt Law School, working for John Beasley, have you thought about what sort of influence they had on you?
John Beasley particularly had a great influence on me. I remember him to being such a competent people person, particularly administrator as well. But I asked him one day, I said, why aren't you out in the business world? You would make a lot of money out there and so forth. And he said something to me that I've carried forth all of my career. He said, I wanted to be a part of something larger than myself and be able to make a contribution to that larger entity. And he did. And in fact, he just retired this year from Vanderbilt. And he's made a great contribution to that institution.
So then you look around, you decide to stay in Nashville. How did you choose a place to practice?
Obviously, I was interested in some place that had the opportunity to try to practice corporate and securities law. There were two firms, basically, that had that type of background in their history. One was the Waller Lanston firm, and the other was the Bass Berry firm. Bass at that time was a little bit larger, but it also had a young lawyer there that I had known because he went to MBA Duke and Vanderbilt Law School, Brad Reed. And Brad Reed had developed a client that was a business icon in Nashville, Jack Massey. And Jack Massey was the founder of Kentucky Fried Chicken and HCA, among others. And he was interested in having a lawyer that knew how to deal with securities and corporate law matters. And Brad, when I came to interview at the firm, talked to me about me following him around and learning the trade, so to speak. And so he was very influential, and the firm had impeccable credentials as a leading firm. But I really worried when I came to the firm that I would be not doing that kind of work that I really wanted to do. Nothing could be further from the truth, as it all turned out.
Did you have any difficulty making the transition from teaching to practicing law?
Not really. It was really an interesting experience in leaving the academic faculty meetings and in coming into the Bass, Berry and Sims Monday morning gatherings where we talked about everything that was going on in the firm. It was just a different beat, a different passion. Elliot Cheatham, interestingly, the first month I was out in practice, called me up with a referral from the National Education Association to take on a litigation case in East Tennessee involving a principal of a high school over there who ran for public office in violation of the Hatch Act. And so, you know, immediately I got thrown into something I didn't know anything about, but learned.
Do you remember your first day on the job?
Yeah, the first day on my job was really interesting because back then Bass, Berry and Sims was the American Trust Building, and the American Trust Building still had an elevator operator, and we'd go up to the 10th floor, which was the major floor of Bass, Berry and Sims, and you'd come into this little entry hall and you'd have these impressive frosted glass doors with gold lettering of all the partners. Actually, every member of the firm was on it. And I sat there not knowing really what to expect, and Ted Pappas at that time was the hiring partner, and he came back and got me, came out to the front and got me and take me back to his office, and we chatted a while, and he said, well, would you like to see your office? I said, absolutely, sir. So he walks me down the hall to one of these frosted glass window doors, opens it up, and my mouth just dropped to the floor because there was nothing in the office but a rug. And I naively said, Mr. Pappas, when can I expect my desk and chair to come in? The response was, classically, whenever you go out and buy it, Mr. Cheek. And at that time, the tradition of the firm was every lawyer that came into the firm had to provide his own furniture. Quite a different beat than Sherman and Sterling in New York City, for sure.
Do you remember?
And I still practice with that desk.
Do you remember the partners in the firm at that time?
Absolutely. I actually met Cecil Sims, who was one of the original Sims, a couple of times at the law school, never down at the firm, but his son, Woody Sims, was there, and he was sort of, I guess, the primary senior lawyer that dealt with corporate matters. And then there was Bill Berry, who was, as you know, one of the leading estate planning lawyers in the town, or broader than the town. There was Mr. Bass. He certainly was a revered figure even at that time in the firm. And Ted Pappas, and Russ Morris, and Jim Bass, and Warner Bass, and Brad Reed. I think I was the 13th person in the firm at that time.
Were others hired the same year you were hired?
I don't think so. Was it?
Were Charlie Ray and Bill Osier hired?
Charlie Ray and Bill Osier were already there.
Oh, they were already there.
They were there the year before I came.
I see. Yeah.
So I didn't mean to omit them earlier, but they were fresh like me.
Do you remember the kinds of projects that you got?
Mostly, as they said when you came to the firm, the wind will always blow your direction from Woody Sims's desk. And so literally I got, it was really true, you'd come in the morning and there was a pack of something on your desk that says, please handle this, Woody. And, you know, in that first year, I did everything. I tried divorce cases. I ran real estate titles. I drafted wills and trusts, and did relatively little in the corporate and securities area that first year. And I was a bit concerned about that. But as it turned out, those years were really formative in my experience base, to have been in the courtroom, to having to build a case, to having to write a will and engage in a personal relationship. It was a really great training program. I think young lawyers miss that today, that kind of breadth.
Tell us about the development of the business and securities practice that you built.
Well, I go back to Woody Sims, who had a group of business clients, and those clients, Woody, for the most part, asked me to help him with. And one of the big transactions, there were two big transactions that in the early 70s were particularly challenging and formative for me in building that type of practice. One was the sale of Martha White Foods to Beatrice, and the other was the formation of an ultimate sale of a company that owned Forest Life Insurance, Blair Fallin insurance agencies, and so forth, called Centercon. And Centercon was ultimately sold to Caroon and Black in New York, and Richard Miller, a Nashvilleian, became the CEO of Caroon and Black, which was an internationally based firm. And I was able to, either because Woody wasn't interested or had other things he was interested in, he pretty much turned those things over to me, and I was able to have success there and gained a little bit of reputation there.
So you, fairly early in your career, you had exposure to representing public companies then?
That's right. Both those entities were public companies, yeah.
Did you remain involved with Vanderbilt during those years?
I did. They were nice enough to ask me to continue on as an adjunct professor, and so I taught typically short courses, but sometimes full semester courses that were seminars during that period of time.
And those courses were in?
All corporate securities
courses.
Yeah.
So the practice develops, and so over time, just tell us about a few of the more interesting clients and deals you've been involved with.
Well, the ones I can tell, right?
The ones you can talk about, yes.
I'll tell you a few of the more momentous ones. The firm represented National Life and Accident Insurance Company, which formed a holding company called NLT. NLT became the subject of a hostile takeover by American General, a larger company in Texas that wanted to expand their business through acquisition. We were engaged by NLT to provide a defense. And they also had Davis, Polk, and Wardwell as part of their counsel and helping defend the takeover. And in the process of that, I came up with a concept of what became known as a Pac-Man defense. If you remember, Pac-Man was an arcade game where people would eat each other up and so forth. Little icons would eat each other up. So I thought we had a regulatory advantage at that time because we could get approval in Tennessee to go acquire American General quicker than American General could get approval to acquire NLT. So we launched a hostile takeover of American General. It was the first time that defense was used in corporate America, and we got a lot of publicity about it. It became a staple of defensive tactics in the M&A game, merger and acquisition game. And so, unfortunately, because they kept raising the price to take over NLT, the NLT board decided to capitulate and sell itself to American General at a much higher price than it would have been had we not developed that defense. So that was a great moment as a young lawyer to have that experience and opportunity. J.C. Bradford and Company I'd had, of course, a long relationship with the people over there, but they had never developed an investment banking group until I guess the late 70s, maybe early 80s. And Mr. Bradford asked Luke Simmons to form a corporate finance department that would engage in underwriting public offerings. And I had been part of several of their early attempts representing the companies that were going public. And when Luke had a difficult situation that was in need of underwriters' counsel, he called me up and asked me to serve as underwriters' counsel for J.C. Bradford. And that began a multi-decade relationship with J.C. Bradford, representing them on all types of merger, acquisition, and securities offerings. And through that, oftentimes the public companies that came out of that process did not have sophisticated corporate and securities counsel, and we, the firm, often became counsel to the companies as well. So it was a real benefit to the firm and a real reputational gaining point of time for me. So that was another one. Another one that has a kind of funny story, and I'll just do two more, and then I'll quit this passage because we'd be here all day. But Ingram Industries. Ingram Industries had a majority position of a software company located in California called Micro D. And Bronson Ingram had called me and asked me to help him with negotiating a transaction where he would acquire the rest of the stock. So we were out in California working on that transaction when it became clear that they weren't willing to sell on terms that Bronson was willing to buy. And so in the middle of the night, at like 1 o'clock, we just finished negotiating. We're in the same hotel as the lawyers for the company. And we're trying to sneak out and get on a jet to go to the printer to launch a hostile takeover of the company the next day. And as we were walking out, all the other lawyer teams come in. We got our suitcases and everything, and we're walking out to catch a plane to launch a hostile takeover. And they all said, "Well, where are you going?" "Well, we're going to another hotel." You know, it was an embarrassing moment. We launched the hostile takeover and were successful in obtaining that stock. And the last one, which is very meaningful to me, was Genesco. Bassberry and Sims originally, Frank Berry represented Genesco for many years with Maxie Jarman was head of it. They had a falling out about a legal opinion, and Bassberry lost the business. My father, remember, was working there. And when they had a CEO that the board wanted to terminate, they called me to represent the board, and we were successful in that effort. And then they asked me to represent the company, and we continued to represent that company. So it was sort of a full circle of a legacy of my father, a legacy of the firm. The firm had originally done it. My father had been there for so many years, and it's been a very meaningful relationship to me.
Jim, talk a little bit about your involvement with the American Bar Association and your role in developing a reputation nationally.
That probably is the most significant force that led me to have a national reputation and be able to attract national clients. I was blessed very early as a result of my teaching experience to have a number of speaking opportunities at CLE seminars. At that time, the American Bar Association had a very small committee of 30 that was the leading group of securities practitioners that interfaced with the Securities and Exchange Commission. And I got invited to be on that committee. And that committee became much more expansive, and many years later I was asked to chair that committee, and at that time the committee was 1,750 lawyers across the country, and I interacted with the New York Stock Exchange, the SEC, and all those folks in dealing with major policy matters. And then later on I became the chair of the section of business law, which is the whole section that the federal securities law was part of. And so that gave me great opportunities to be known. I was asked to chair the New York Stock Exchange Legal Advisory Committee, and several years later to chair the NASD Legal Advisory Board. So I was getting fairly well known. And then in the aftermath of the WorldCom fraud, there was a hue and cry about corporate responsibility. And I, through my bar and other activities, became the chair of the task force on corporate responsibility to react to WorldCom kinds of fraud. And so that also heightened my visibility. And then I guess the ultimate was in 1993 when Clinton had been elected in 1992 and Gore was his vice president. The Wall Street Journal ran a front page story that I was going to be named chairman of the SEC. That didn't happen for a whole lot of reasons that I naively didn't understand at the time. I understand it a little better now, but it's very politicized between the Gore people and Hillary Clinton's team. And I lost out, but then again when Al Gore was running for president in 2000 and was close to being elected, I was supposed to be the chairman of the SEC at that time. So all of that got me a lot of national recognition without the hassle of actually doing the job. So anyhow, that's a very short form career of why I was able to get into that position. And later it led to assignments like we spent almost a decade being the regulatory auditor of the New York Stock Exchange, and that was pursuant to a court decree in New York where an independent regulatory auditor had to be engaged by the New York Stock Exchange to engage to oversee certain violations that they had historically engaged in. And the SEC recommended me, and a lot of the New York bar recommended me to the judge, and we got appointed there. So that sort of gives you full circle how all that happens.
And Jim,
just lucky.
Not really. The corporate department when you joined the firm basically was you and Woody
and Brad.
Yes. Do you know how many attorneys are in our corporate group today?
No. 60?
A lot.
The 60, yeah. 60, 70, I don't know. But Bob Thompson and Mike Peake and Lee Walton all came in the 70s to begin the formation of that group. They're just as instrumental as I was in how that group has grown.
So you felt like there was a good team working with you on
Absolutely. I mean, you need a team to do that kind of work. You can't do it all yourself.
Tell us, switch from your business career for a moment and talk about your personal situation. You said that you married in
1968, June 1st. I married a girl named Sigourney Woods, who was born in Greenwich Village and grew up in the Westchester County town of Purchase, New York. Her father was a professor at Manhattanville College.
What was his name?
His name was Daniel Woods. And the story about Sigourney is interesting because it all came out of Sherman and Sterling. I was there the freshman summer. I was there, and I'm sitting at my desk looking for something to do, and the phone rang, and the person on the other side of the phone said, "Please come see Mr. Ford right away." Well, Mr. Ford was one of the senior partners at the firm, and I got very excited about an important assignment here. Got my legal pad, pens, raced up the stairs to Mr. Ford's office, and the assistant showed me in his outer office. I sat there for 10, 15, 20 minutes, sweating a little bit, not knowing what was coming up, and finally I got into Mr. Ford's office. He looked down, he had his glasses like this. He said, "Mr. Cheek." I said, "Yes, Mr. Ford. I've heard so many good things about you." And I'm puffing up and ready to take down this important job. He says, "I got a very, very important job for you." I said, "Yes, sir, great." So one of my most important clients of the firm, pause, has a daughter living in New York this summer, and she's living with 6 girls, and I understand that you, and I was single at that time, you know the single young lawyers in the summer crowd and first year crowd, and I'd really appreciate if you'd organize a dinner for these girls that are up there. I'll give you her name. And well, it wasn't Sigourney, but Sigourney was one of the girls, and so we became a fast couple that summer and then continued to date thereafter. So that's my blessing. She loved Nashville. She came down to Nashville and not only produced 3 sons from our family, but became a significant force in the activities around Nashville not-for-profit.
She was very active in that not-for-profit scene, was she not?
She was.
And did that contribute to your professional career?
Not only that, but she gladly, she loved to entertain, and she gladly entertained the firm every summer at summer clerk parties and at social functions for the firm. So yes, and for clients as well. She was a great asset to my career.
And then that had sort of it had a tragic end. Talk a little bit about that.
Well, unfortunately, in 2005, she was diagnosed with a lymphoma cancer, blood cancer, that she fought bravely for 5 years, ultimately trying and hoping that a stem cell transplant would enable that disease to be conquered, but it didn't, and she died in 2010. And it was a great loss to me and my family, and we miss her every day of life.
But you have remarried, have you not?
I remarried in 2013, performed by the Reverend James Gooch. And the experience of having a new relationship and a new extended family has been extraordinary. I'm so blessed to have had 2 wonderful women in my life. The woman I married is Nancy Johnson Weaver, who was married to one of my good friends growing up, Bill Weaver. And Nikki, as she is known, was Sigourney's best friend. And so it's so a little bit surreal, but we have intertwined our families together, and I've found a new life and new set of blessings to carry us forward. She lost her husband some years prior to Sigourney's death to MS. And one of the curious, again, sort of facts that exist about that is that the house I grew up in next to my grandmother, Bill Weaver, had grown up in prior to me. And so there's a full, unusual circle there.
And you had known both Nikki and Bill for many years.
We vacationed together. Our families, our children were very close friends growing up. They lived 2 doors down from us for years, and that was a real blessing. We have a family unit called the Wee Cheeks, and everybody has a good time together.
And Jim, you mentioned you have 3 sons. Tell us just a little bit about those boys.
Very blessed to have 3 sons. My oldest son is James Howe Cheek IV. I'm sorry that he had that burden, but he had a son, and that son's James Howe V. So it continues on in the Southern tradition. But Jamie Cheek, as he is known, is the CEO and one of the senior partners of Floyd, Bumstead, McCready, and McCarthy, which are in the business management of the music industry. My second middle son was Daniel Woods Cheek, named for his maternal grandfather. Daniel is a medical doctor, an emergency room doctor. He lives in Denver, Colorado, and he has one child with another one due in 2 weeks, a boy and a girl. I should have mentioned Jamie has two children, James Howe the fifth, a boy who's at MBA in the 7th grade, and Baker Cheek, who's in the 6th grade at Harpeth Hall. And then the third child is Matthew Huddleston Cheek, Huddleston for my maternal grandparents. And Matthew spent years out in Colorado searching for the holy grail of being a music star and never quite reaching that. He came back to Nashville and has bought a business called Cumberland Sales Company that is in the rope and wire sales and distribution business. He's done very, very well.
Jim, how has the practice of law changed at our firm over the years?
Well, James, there are a lot of pluses to it, certainly from a technology point of view and ability to deliver legal services in the context of the way the law is practiced today. It is at the epitome, at the top, but we've lost along the way the collegial intimacy that existed when I was the 13th guy, when we were under 40 or 50, and now we're closing in on 300 if we're not quite there yet. And so it's much more, and the law business itself is a much more economically focused business today. And I miss the coffee hours we used to have in American Trust Building. Every morning at 10 o'clock we would go in the library and have coffee with each other and with other lawyers in the community, hear stories. You'd learn that way. You built collegiality that was very meaningful. There's no time to do that today.
So, would you advise young people today who are considering careers, what would you say to them about the practice of law?
Consider it carefully. I think the law is still, I teach a course, for the last 4 years I was actually a professor of practice of law out at Vanderbilt Law School and taught 2 full semester courses. One of those courses I taught was the profession of law as a business. And I emphasize the fact that the law is still a regal and wonderful profession that has enough meaning to be able to be a person of influence in any part of a community. And that's unique. And so, to me, the business of law is something that you have to adjust to and be a part of. But being a lawyer and being a public servant and acting in the best interest of the community is a privilege that should never be underestimated. Done.
So, Jim, just a couple of more questions. It's a fast-paced world. You're busy. How do you deal with the various tensions of practice?
I think that is one of the impacts of the way the law business works today. It almost every year that every decade I've been in, the tensions of practice have have risen, in part because of technology, in part because of client instant expectations and things of that sort, but also just dealing with a larger institution. But I always felt, from my point of view, the way it worked for me was it was highly dependent on exercise. In my first years at the firm, I would block off every Tuesday and Thursday. I'm not sure all my partners knew about this at the time, but I would block off Tuesdays and Thursdays from 11 o'clock to 1:30. And I would go play basketball at McGugin.
McGugin is
the Vanderbilt campus basketball floor. And, you know, we played for a good hour. I would run up and down, play full court basketball, and come back totally refreshed and able to deal with the tensions of the afternoon. Later in life, when basketball became a little too tough for me to do, I continued to evolve my tennis, and in the last 10 years have taken it to a level of practicing for and playing in various national tennis tournaments. Had some degree of success. I've won several of the Southern tournaments, and most recently played in the World Super Senior Championships in Orlando, Florida, where out of 128 draw, I upset the 15th seed, the 10th seed, and lost in the round of 16. And so that was a real thrill for me. But the way it worked with my practice, it was something apart from the practice that required concentration or exertion of physical activity that took away a lot of the tension. So I would highly recommend that people look for things other than alcohol and drugs to deal with that tension. And as many lawyers know, those are real problems within the legal industry today. A lot of folks have dependency that are designed to relieve the tension. Not the best way to do it.
Jim, last question. So you've been with this firm almost 50 years, 45 years?
Well, I came in 1960, well, no, I worked in the summertime in 1968, but then I guess that didn't count. But I got here fully in 1970, so I'm a little shy of 50 years.
So you've had obviously a very distinguished career on a national level. Have you thought about leaving Bass, Berry & Sims?
Actually, I've thought about it a lot, many times, because I had a lot of opportunities offered to me where I could have made more money, a lot more money in some cases. I had the opportunity to perhaps serve as chairman of the SEC, and we really didn't mention the fact that I was approached a couple of times to be a commissioner on the SEC. So I've thought about it in that light. I've thought about it with business opportunities. I've had several opportunities to join corporations, and as you know, corporations give equity compensation in the form of options, and again, that probably may have been more lucrative. But I always felt coming back to what Dean Beasley told me of the importance of being part of something larger than yourself. And I felt like Bass, Berry & Sims was my home. And it you know, gave me a very comfortable living, gave me incredible opportunities from an intellectual point of view, incredible people to work with, and I couldn't think of a more useful place to have a life spent. And I think, and this is not consistent with the way many younger people look at their careers, where they think it's more enriching every 5 years to go someplace else and have a different set of experiences. I've had incredible incredible sets of experiences here that are exceptionally varied, challenging, and economically rewarding, and it's home. And I couldn't be more proud of this firm and my partners and all the lawyers in this firm to have built what we have built and will continue to build, and I am a privileged soul to have worked here.
Thank you very much.